Hey everyone, this is Brown at I Have Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Flesh by Richard Laymon. Flesh was a horror novel that was written in 1988, and as far as the output of Richard Laymon is concerned, Flesh is oftentimes regarded as one of his best works. And speaking as someone who's recently been able to read some of his books, I'd say that Flesh is definitely up there. So for those of you who don't know, Richard Laymon was a horror writer who had a distinctive pulp style of writing, and he would oftentimes, within the first few pages of a book, drop the reader into a situation that was, downright disturbing and yet morbidly fascinating. Basically reeling in the audience, into, say, a place where they did not want to stick around and stare, and yet they just could not look away. And so combining that with a wonderfully fast-paced approach to writing, and not relying on the slow burn approach, the reader was oftentimes compelled to, finish the book, whether they liked the story or not. And they were basically just compelled to, finish reading. And even his naysayers, do not deny that Richard Laymon had a sort of energy that was entirely his own and made him stand out in the horror crowd. Sort of like, okay, whether you like him or not, you're reading a Richard Laymon novel. But on the other hand, when it came to, say, the types of stories he would write, he tended to tap into the darkness of humanity. And, granted, his characterization was usually not the deepest of characterizations. Say protagonists were oftentimes developed just enough to, get the reader to want to, finish reading the book. But on the other hand, the characters tended to be more than a little shallow at times, and more often than not, unfortunately. But also, the antagonists were just irredeemably evil, and basically, they were morally reprehensible and just, disgusting when it came to, say, the violence they inflicted on others. And so, on one hand, I definitely have to give Richard Laymon, credit in terms of, say, being able to, tap into, say, a primal dark side of humanity, wherein, you have violence that is a part of the everyday world, which is a sad truth. You could be having a wonderful day, but somewhere else, someone's, having something horrible happen to them. It's that kind of, primal fear that Richard Laymon was able to tap into, and disturb readers with. While I definitely have to give credit to Richard Laymon for actually being able to do his job as a horror writer and disturb the reader, he did unfortunately tend to rely on sexual violence at times. And that is something that, while I can appreciate, sex and horror, kind of going hand in hand. Hell, one of my favorite horror movies was Hellraiser. And there you go, a rather dark depiction of sexuality, but Layman's approach was in the realm of sexual violence. And so, that was something that turned a lot of readers off, and oftentimes understandably so. And while I genuinely do like some of his work, there were, times where even I was kind of like, yeah, that's too much. But that being said, while Richard Laymon never left that realm of darkness, when he was able to work within that realm and also focus on, characterization and also developing, say, the story, like, say, taking it from beyond a fascinating premise or an intriguing premise to, hey, this is actually a good story. Well, that's when you have good horror novels. And so you know, you almost have to be a horror fan to get into his work, because if you're not a horror fan, you're not going to like his stuff. You know, whether you're reading a good book of his or a bad book, you're going to be, you know, disturbed either way, and you're not going to want to, you know, finish reading the book. But if you're a horror fan, you should definitely check his stuff out, or at the very least, you know, try some of his stuff out. But in my experience, you know, I've had sort of a, you know, 50-50 bit when it comes to, say, how I liked some of his work, and how I didn't like some of his other work. Because up until recently, I had read 6 novels of his, and 3 of the novels I liked, the other 3 I did not. So the 3 that I did not like were The Cellar, which was his very first novel, and while it does have a large fan base, I didn't particularly like it, you know, mainly because I'm not trying to, you know, sound like Mr. Puritan here or anything like that, but that was a novel that, in my opinion, relied too much on sexual violence. And so while, I mean, there were, you know, some, you know, good moments of, say, you know, violence and action here and there, like in terms of, say, fights and what have you, those few moments, you know, didn't redeem the book. And so while I was definitely compelled to finish because of, say, the fast-paced writing, you know, the sexual violence just, you know, basically turned me off. So, and I had a similar problem with another book of his, One Rainy Night. And so while the idea for that one was intriguing, basically it just seemed like he used that as an excuse to, you know, basically, you know, write, you know, people, you know, becoming, you know, sex crazed sadists. And so so yeah, The Cellar and One Rainy Night I didn't particularly enjoy. But on the other hand, the third novel of his that I read that I didn't like, and yet I would say was the best of the 3, was Resurrection Dreams. And I actually did a review on that one. And so Resurrection Dreams was something that had a genuinely good start and had some, you know, rather fascinating ideas about, say, you know, zombie horror. And Richard Laymon was actually able to, you know, tap into, you know, that, you know, realm of, you know, violence and sexuality, and create some intriguing situations. And so, granted, I mean, this was, you know, some, you know, twisted sexuality, mind you, or some twisted depictions of sexuality. And then, of course, when you came to the horror violence, I mean, well, there you go. I mean, you're reading a Richard Laymon novel. But there were moments in that novel that stood out as being good. And it's kind of like you saw where the novel itself could have been good, as opposed to just, say, having good moments or just a good start. But unfortunately, while he was able to, you know, give us some bits here and there that were good, the majority of the book, unfortunately, suffered from the same problem or a similar problem that The Cellar and One Rainy Night had. And so, and also, you know, the one of the main characters on Resurrection Dreams was a villain antagonist who was in no way, you know, compelling or, you know, even twistedly, you know, likable, like, say, someone like Hannibal Lecter might be, you know, that kind of thing. Like, you can have villain antagonists that are, you know, just, you know, admittedly evil, but there can be something enjoyable about reading, you know, from their perspectives. But, you know, when you have a villain antagonist who takes up a majority of the book, and not being in any way compelling or, you know, I dare say likable, I mean, the whole book suffers as a result. And so, yeah, Resurrection Dreams, I mean, while it could have been a good book, and there were some moments I liked. I didn't particularly enjoy reading the book as a whole. So, on the other hand, though, the other three books I read by him that I did like were Island, The Traveling Vampire Show, and Night in the Lonesome October. And ironically, it's that very last book that was my introduction to Richard Laymon. And I found a Night in the Lonesome October at Half Price Books that used to be in Richardson. And I'd heard a lot about Richard Laymon at the time, but I'd never read any of his stuff. And so, just on a lark, I picked it up and read it, and like, damn, this is some good stuff here. Like, that was an instance wherein, I mean, once again, he tapped into the dark side of humanity, and almost took the reader on a tour of this sort of shadow world almost. I mean, it was the everyday world, but at night it turned into something just bizarre and terrifying. And yet, because you had a very fleshed out protagonist who was a good guy, we as readers were inclined to go along for the ride, and as a result, we got one of his best works. And so, Traveling Vampire Show, Island, and Night in the Lonesome October, all three of those I thoroughly enjoyed. And while they definitely had the trademark, sex and violence that comes with a Richard Laymon novel, the protagonists tended to, be well written, and also, suffer from, a almost, relatable form of alienation. And so, even if they were with, several other people, in some instances, I mean, they just felt like they were alone, for one reason or another. And that theme of alienation, I thought, was very well explored in those three novels, and they were very relatable. And I think that's kind of what helped the books to stand out. Plus, he actually put forth time and effort into, say, taking a good premise in each book and actually developing it to where it was a good story. So the sad thing is, Night in Lonesome October was his last completed work, because he died of a heart attack in 2001. And there were a couple other books that were put out after Night in the Lonesome October, but they were only partially completed, and someone else came in and did some ghostwriting to finish the books up. And so I haven't read those books, but I've been told that basically you know when Richard Laymon started the book, and when someone else took over, that kind of thing. So at the very least, Night in the Lonesome October served as my introduction to his work, and sadly was the last thing he wrote. But in terms of, say, a complete work, but it was a good note to go out on. So Flesh was a book that I had heard a bit about through the grapevine, online, and just other people who like horror. They tend to recommend Flesh and say, hey, if you want to see one of his best works, or read one of his best books, I mean, Flesh is definitely something you ought to check out. So I did, and yeah, this was a good one. I will say that while I'm thankful to have been able to get a copy of the book, I had hoped to be able to find, say, one of the copies from when it originally came out, like in the 80s, because, I mean, there was some really cool cover art. Like, you see this hand that's sort of reaching up to the sky while the sun's setting, and you see, like, it's kind of torn up and everything, and one of its fingers is missing. But basically just some, a hand with some torn up flesh, and on the other hand, though, some of the cover art has that same hand, but with this grotesque looking worm-like creature curling itself around this torn up hand. And so some striking cover art, to be sure, but unfortunately whenever I was trying to find those particular copies, they proved to be unavailable, so I had to settle for one of these re-releases. So I mean you got this dead woman on the cover here, and so I mean, yeah, you have the idea that you're about to read something disturbing, but you don't have that striking cover art that the original artwork was. And so, but nonetheless, I'm glad to have been able to get a copy, and I'm glad to have finally read Flesh. So let's go ahead and get into it. Okay, so right away we kind of start off with a bang, because there's this crazed motorist named Eddie who is trying to run this woman down, and this is kind of in a rural area, right? So he's driving down a country road, and he sees this girl on a bike and just decides, I'm going to run her down. And he does run her off the road, but instead of hitting her, she actually falls off the bike. So while he destroys the bike, he doesn't actually hit her, but she gets hurt pretty bad. And so she lives, but Eddie doesn't, because after he plows into her bike, he ends up plowing into a guardrail and gets killed on impact because the car explodes. And so the girl, whose name was Celia, was a young college student, and she was just on her way to catch up and do some studies there, but then she ends up getting run down by this insane motorist and banged up some, and she has to wear a cast for a bit. But a couple of officers arrive on the scene, because some people saw of the fire that was coming from the van that Eddie was driving. And so the main officer on the scene is a guy named Jake Corey, who's sort of a figure of authority in the local police department. And he's the one who interviews Celia and takes her statement, and she tells him as best she can what happened. I mean, she was riding down the street on her bike, and this dude in the van just tried to run her over, and she tried to veer over to where the guy would have plenty of room, but he kept on following her, and then finally just tried to hit her. And it was only just by dumb luck that her bike it hit like a ditch or something, to where the wheels twisted to where it kind of threw her off the bike, and instead of hitting her, the van just plowed through the bike and destroyed it. But she was thrown off, and while she was hurt, I mean, she was able to walk away from it, but she's hurt pretty bad and banged up. But so Jake takes her statement, and he and the other officer on the scene, they see that Eddie is dead. Okay, I mean, he's charcoaled, but as he's looking at the scene, he sees a blood trail that's coming from the back of the van, and so he follows it, and this blood trail, it goes into a field, and it starts to spread out. And as he's following it, he sees that it's leading towards this old dilapidated inn called the Oakwood Inn. And this place has been closed for several years because a lot of people unfortunately died from food poisoning in that place. But this couple from out of town had came into the place to, they came into this rural town because they wanted to fix the Oakwood Inn up and try running their own hotel business or motel business, right? Or sort of like a bed and breakfast type place. So Jake, he follows the blood trail to where the Oakwood Inn is, and he finds the people, Ron and Peggy, the couple from out of town, and he introduces himself, and after a tense standoff initially, um, and once he's able to verify that they're the couple that are taking care of the place, and neither one of them was an accomplice of Eddie. Um, he basically tells him the situation that we had someone try to murder a girl by running her over, and while one of the perps was killed on impact, because the van plowed into a guardrail. There's a possibility that there was someone else in the van that's hiding out, in the area, as in hiding out near this inn. So basically, he tells Ron and Peggy, that just to be on a safe side, you guys might want to leave this place and stay clear of it for a few days until we're able to confirm, whether or not this guy's accomplice is still in the area. And so, Ron and Peggy, they tell Jake that, okay, thanks for the warning, and yeah, it's pretty scary. Yeah, we'll go as soon as we get some stuff squared away here, and then we'll hit the road. Thanks for letting us know what's going on. And so so Jake, he goes back and to basically take some notes and what have you, and try and figure out what's going on here. But in the meantime, though, Ron and Peggy, they don't take Jake's advice, and in fact, they leave the place for a little bit, but then later on they come back in the evening, and they because Peggy is being insistent that they need to get some work done on renovating the place. And so Ron is actually kind of being the sensible one, saying, "Hey, this guy, this officer seemed pretty serious, and if there's some nut job, lurking around the area, we probably shouldn't risk, being attacked by him." But Peggy's all like, "Well, hey, we can take care of ourselves, and in fact, they even have a shotgun, right?" So they're like, so Ron's like, "Okay, all right, we'll go back to the inn and start renovating it, right?" And so they go back, and in the meantime, Jake, he decides to later on he come back to the field and to that area to see if he can find more clues, or see if he can find the perpetrator himself, or the accomplice, I should say. And so when he gets to the area, he stakes the place out, but he sees that Ron and Peggy have returned, and basically were ignoring his advice. And so, as frustrated as he is, he decides, okay, I'll just scope the scene out. I'm not going to make a big deal of angrily banging on the door and demanding that they leave. It's just hey, I'm just gonna watch and see what happens here, see if I can spot anything. In the meantime, Ron and Peggy, they're working inside the inn when Peggy hears something, and this is even with the radio playing, she hears something coming from the basement, like something moving around down there, or something falling over. And she turns the radio off, and she's telling Ron that it sounds like there's something in the basement. And so Ron's like, well, wait a minute, I thought you said there was nothing to be scared of. You're the one who is telling me that I'm being a chicken for wanting to to leave, when this, police officer is telling us, we need to leave, and you're the one who's, insisting that we stay. So what? Which one is it? And so, now Peggy, even though she was the one who insisted that they, come back to the inn, even though if there's, a killer in the area, now the reality of it's kind of sinking in. She's like, I mean, maybe some stuff just fell over in the basement, or maybe it's just an animal down there or something. But yeah, it's getting dark outside, and yeah, there's a killer running around out there, or there might be a killer out there. Yeah, I don't want to be here now. This is a bad situation. I realize that now. But Ronnie, I mean, he's all like, he's pretty pissed off at her, so as wife, and so basically, because she was taunting him about wanting to leave earlier, and yet and yet now she's wanting to leave and insisting that they leave, and so he takes a shotgun and says, "Okay, look, I'll check the basement out, and then we'll leave, okay?" And so Peggy's, basically begging him, not to go into the basement. I mean, she's that terrified. It's just something about it. Just, it's hitting her that this could be something very real, and she was, foolish to, blow it off earlier. So, Ron takes a shotgun, and he goes down to the basement, and all she can see, because she's staying upstairs, and all she can see is the light coming from the basement, because there's like a light bulb that Ron was able to turn on, and she can't see him, but she's asking if he's okay and if he can see anything. And at first, she hears him, and he's like, "I'm okay, and I don't see anything." But then suddenly, he yells out, and it's like a panicked, painful yell, and she's like, she starts freaking out, and begging him to tell her what's going on. And so a moment or so later, Ron nonchalantly walks up with a shotgun in hand, and he's got this sort of sheepish smile on his face, and he's telling her, basically, darndest thing, it was a rat. It just ran across me, and I've never seen a rat before. And she's like, are you sure? And because, I mean, you sounded terrified, and it just wasn't just a, yelp. This was like, you were scared. And so he's like, it was just a rat. Everything's fine. And then he takes a shotgun and blows her away. And so when that happens, Jake, who's watching the place from outside, he hears the gun go off, and so he takes his gun, his pistol, and runs into the place, and he's looking around and trying to see if he can get an idea of what happened, and he sees Peggy on the ground in a pool of blood, and he sees Ron over her, and he's asking Ron, what happened? Was the guy here? Did he do this? I mean, tell me where this guy is, because he's thinking that it's Eddie's accomplice, who's struck. But then once he starts to take the scene in, he's seeing something that he can't explain. He sees Peggy on the ground, and Ron's leaning over her, and he initially thought that Ron was checking on his wife and trying to help her, but he's actually eating her. He's biting into her flesh, and he's just being so nonchalant about it. And he looks up at Jake, and he just had this sort of disinterested look in his eyes, but he's looking right at Jake. And that's when he picks up his shotgun and starts to aim at Jake. And Jake, in turn, uses his pistol and kills Ron on the spot. And so his body's so he calls dispatch and tells him what happened, and Ron's body is taken away, and so is Peggy's. But he's like, what the hell just happened? What was that? And so, in the meantime, though, he's having to write a report on what happened, and do his best to tell what he saw, and make as much sense as possible. Um, but on the other hand, though, there's an extra area of concern for him because he has a daughter. He has a little girl named Kimmy who's 4 years old, and he and his wife were divorced, and they share custody of her. And so his ex-wife and Kimmy, they live nearby, and so it was bad enough, the idea of a wounded maniac, being on the loose. But now, I mean, you know, after seeing, this guy, literally eating his wife, I mean, he's just, terrified. And so, he's like, he's really wanting to make sure that, his daughter's okay because of, she's in the area. And so, when he, when he has her for visitation, he basically, does his best to, not let her out of his sight, and, Kimmy actually, favors him over, her mother, because her mother, tends to be, sort of dismissive of her and disinterested in her. And basically, she's a lot more materialistic about things, and, doing the best she can to look for a good time and what have you. Because she actually remarried, right? But the guy she remarried was the guy that she was cheating on him, with. And so, basically, Jake doesn't have, anything in the way of fondness for the new guy, or for his ex-wife. But at the same time, he kind of understands how it may have happened, because, he was, they were high school sweethearts, and, she had always been sort of a wild thing, and he had been the more responsible one. But when he, got a job as a police officer, it took a lot of time away from the two of them. And so, when they're both trying to, raise a kid together, and, and Jake's not able to spend as much time with, his family as he had wanted to because of his job, and you have, Kimmy's mother, who was kind of a wild woman. I mean, it was almost inevitable that she would cheat. And so, he doesn't blame the new guy for what happened, but at the same time, he doesn't like the new guy now. And he certainly isn't fond of his ex-wife, but he tries to be polite to her and cordial because, hey, that's the mother of his kid, right? And so, but Kimmy, though, I mean, that's his, pride and joy. That's his angel, So, so he's on edge for some very understandable reasons. I mean, so when he learns from Kimmy that, that her mother and, his ex-wife has basically just been sort of uncaring towards her, I mean, he's not real happy about it, but he's also basically just, kind of under pressure to be extra vigilant, with her, because there's some really messed up stuff going on in the neighborhood. But meantime, though, we meet the character of Roland, who, attends the local college, and he has a rather morbid fixation with blood and violence and gore and carnage. And basically, he kind of goes out of his way to be as weird as possible, and sort of disturb whoever it is he's talking to, whether it's someone he knows or someone he doesn't know from Adam. He goes out of his way to disturb them with say gruesome trivia about things, like about real life, atrocities and things like that. And like he'll have T-shirts with illustrated butchery on them and things like that. So basically, going out of his way to freak people out. And he comes and he makes his way to a girl named Dana, who is actually the girlfriend of his roommate James. And so the reason he's going out of his way to see her is because she has a Polaroid camera that he's wanting to borrow from her. Because he was wanting to go to the Oakwood Inn, because this is a few days after the bloodbath, at the Oakwood Inn. That it was a crime scene and everything. So he's wanting to go to the Oakwood Inn, to check the place out and see where this gruesome murder happened, and he's hoping to get some pictures of the place. And so and plus the Oakwood Inn already has a gruesome history to it. I mean, with all those people dying of food poisoning all those years ago. And so he's asking Dana if for a camera, and she's disturbed for a number of reasons. One, she's disturbed because of just how fixated he is on this real life tragedy, and how much he's wanting to exploit it. But she's also disturbed because she's like, wait a minute, how do you know I had a Polaroid camera? And then she learns from him that's when she realizes that the only way he could know that she had a Polaroid camera was that he had seen some of the pictures that she had taken with it, namely some sexually explicit ones that she had allowed her boyfriend to take. And so basically she had given him those photos, and James had said that he wasn't going to show them to anyone else. It was just going to be the two of them. And so when she realizes that Roland has seen them, I mean, she's pretty pissed off, because she's wondering, okay, who else has James shown these photos to? And she's never liked Roland. I mean, she's tried to be, nice to him because, because he's, her boyfriend's roommate and everything. But because of, just how much he goes out of his way to be, weird and disturbing, she just can't bring herself to like him. And so finally, she just lets him have it. She calls him out on, the fact that, the reason that he's so weird is because he's afraid that no one else will notice him, or, if he's not weird. She says that he's afraid that, if he isn't the way he is, if he doesn't go out of his way to be the way he is, then no one will pay any attention to him, because this way at least they'll acknowledge him, even if they're terrified of him or grossed out by him. And this kind of hits Roland pretty hard, because that's exactly what he's doing. And then she calls him out for basically using this sort of this morbid fascination with death and gore as a coping mechanism to basically deny that he's himself is afraid of death, and he gets very defensive about it, but she knows that she's got his number. And so he's shaken by this. He was not expecting to be called out on his own bullshit, and so she makes a deal with him. Basically, she'll let him borrow the camera, and she'll give him $100 if he stays the night at the Oakwood Inn, where the murder happened. And basically, she tells him, it's like, okay, you stay there for a whole night. You can have my camera. You can, take pictures of the place, and hell, you may even be able to, spot some ghosts or something. Because the two of them were talking about how places that were where people were killed are supposed to be haunted by ghosts because they're not able to move on because of their horrible manners of death and what have you. And which this actually creeps out Roland even more, because he's already rattled by her being able to call him out on his own bullshit, but at the same time, while he makes a big show of wanting to be where the horror is, he's not actually wanting to be in a place where someone died and that very well may be haunted, and so but Dana is able to persuade him to agree with the deal, because she says, hey, $100, I mean, how much more how many more souvenirs can you get for that? And think about it. I mean, you might even spot a ghost there, and that could basically prove that the stuff that you're interested in matters, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, though, if you lose, if you're not able to stay the whole night there, you don't owe me a cent, okay? You don't have to pay me a thing, but you do have to give me, the pictures, that James showed you, and you have to act like a normal human being. This whole facade you have of being weird on purpose, it ends. And so Roland reluctantly agrees to this because, here he is making a show of, being, Mr. Freakazoid, and then, being called out on it. And so if he turns her down, she's going to know that he's scared, and of both what she's saying and of being in that place, even though he says he wants to go there. So he agrees to the deal, but he has to go shopping for some supplies, and so he goes to the local mall to do so. He gets like a sleeping bag, some snacks, and some handcuffs, which are going to come into play in a bit. But in the meantime, though, at the mall, he bumps into not only Celia, who's at this point still banged up but up and about, but he bumps into Celia and her two friends, Helen and Allison. And Allison is one of the other players in the story, and she's actually a fellow college student of Celia's, and she's actually seen this English major undergrad instructor, and basically kind of having an illicit affair with him. And while the two of them tend to have hot and heavy times together, this guy, this teacher Evan, Allison basically comes to realize that he only cares about her for sex. Like he only values her for sex. Like he doesn't really see her as anything beyond that. And so as much as she enjoys having sex with him, like she's wanting someone who actually cares about her and respects her. And so she actually brings up the idea of the two of them saying, hey, why don't we pump the brakes on that and just see if we can have this relationship not be so reliant on that, because it's like we do nothing but that. And lately there have been instances where he's wanting to do it with her in a rather risky place, like places where people could easily discover them, and also there are times where he's kind of lately been borderline rapey. And so that's another reason why she's wanted to pump the brakes on that. And she's just kind of had this light bulb moment of saying, okay, if this guy, can't be with me beyond that, then he's not for me. And so she broaches the notion to him, and he basically just, blows her off after that. And, it's not but a night later that, she's, working at her job at the local pub, and she, sees Evan with another woman. And, he makes a point to like put his arm around her and make sure that, Allison sees that. And so Allison's, pretty heartbroken by this. And so, I mean, it was bad enough to know that the guy's not even going to try, but, the fact that he found someone just like that, I mean, it hurts her. And so, she, go to her apartment, and, she's, telling Celia and Helen about, what happened and everything. And they're like, hey, you know what? You need to come with us. We need to hang out. Let's go to the mall. Let's, to a Galleria. Let's just take your mind off it. Let's have some fun. And so the three of them, they go to this Galleria, and, basically, just, have a little girl's day out. And Allison, though, I mean, even though she's, trying to, tell herself that Evan's, bad news for her, I mean, she can't just get him out of her mind. And so she, goes to this, department store and gets this sort of sexy negligee to, possibly entice him with at some point in the future. But she's saying that she's not going to do it, but at the same time, she just wants to have it just in case, that kind of thing. But she doesn't want to admit that she's still wanting him in her life. So the three of them, they finish up and they're about to leave, and they bump into Roland, who was getting his supplies for his one-night stay at the Oakwood Inn. And so, they know who Roland is. I mean, he's just as freaky and disturbing with them as he is with everyone else. But he's visibly checking Allison out, looking her up and down and leering at her. And all three of the girls notice this, and basically it disgusts them. And so they're like, okay, we're out of here. So with that having happened, Roland meets Dana, and he guides her, to the Oakwood Inn because he doesn't drive, right? And so he has to guide her to the place. And so the two of them, while she's driving, they talk a little bit, and basically, she's talking more about, the possibility of the place being haunted because of, the people dying there a long time ago, and then this murder having happened. And basically, she's trying to creep Roland out. Like earlier, she was genuinely trying to get through to him, but now she's just trying to really, spook him. And so he is getting spooked, but he's adamant about staying the night there. And so she drops him off, and, she's going to stay outside in her car, to make sure that he doesn't chicken out and run. Or if he does chicken out and run, she'll easily be able to say, gotcha, that kind of thing. So Roland goes into the Oakwood Inn and, basically finds a spot to make camp, and he takes the handcuffs and he cuffs himself to a part of the bar. And then he has the bright idea to take the key to the cuffs and toss it, way away in a corner somewhere. And so, he's just sort of, keeping his eye on things, because even though he knows that there's nothing really in there, it's still a spooky place. And, the talk with Dana really rattled him. And so he's looking around, checking things out, and then he hears something. Like, it sounds like, something wet, falling from the ceiling onto the, bar counter. And sure enough, there is something, because he has a flashlight and he's looking around. At first he can't see anything, but then he does a double take, because there's a creature, like this little worm, like creature, this like veined yellow slug with these mucus gray eyes, slithering towards him, towards his legs. and he just starts flipping out and freaking out, like wetting himself. And he's able to kick it away, but then it goes for him again, and he can't get it in time, and it tears its way into his leg. And at first, he tries to rip it out of him, uh, or he tries to grab it, before it can go all the way in, but then it does something to him. It starts to make him feel good as it's worming its way into his body, through his leg, and then up his spine, like to a point where he can literally feel it, in between his spinal column and his flesh, and it's it's working its way up from his spine, to his neck, and then he can feel it, wriggling its way, eating its way into his brain, which is when it hits him with this wave of overwhelming ecstasy, like this feeling of bliss that he has never experienced in his life, and just, leaves him, in a state of happiness and just, calm. And so in the meantime, though, after this freaky things happened, Dana, Dana goes into the next part of her plan to get revenge on Roland. She doesn't know all this is going on inside, by the way. This is not part of her plan. But she has the bright idea to sneak into the Oakwood Inn, into the back, and get some flour, they use for cooking, and she buy the grocery store, and she basically strips naked and covers herself with the flour, because in the lighting, in the lighting, from the moon that's coming in through the windows, she's going to look like a ghost, and she wants to scare the daylights out of Roland. And so, she finds him, right? And she finds him in this, disgusting state, because he's literally, covered in urine, his own urine, and his pants are around his ankles, and he's just sort of almost catatonic. But then he kind of snaps out of it, and he's telling her, "Get me out of here." And she sees that he's handcuffed, and so he's telling her where the key is, and so she gets the key and unlocks him. And then Roland kills her rather brutally, and then he starts to eat her, because this thing that's in his body, it's his new best friend. And basically, it's telling him, that, if it'll give him more of this wonderful feeling of bliss. It'll be, his, best friend forever, if, it'll give him, if he'll give it what it wants. Namely, it wants to eat. It likes flesh. It likes brains. And so when Roland, kills Dana, he starts eating her flesh himself, but then, he shatters her skull and starts eating her brains, because that's what this worm, this creature, really likes. And so now you've got, this already unhinged, or not quite unhinged, but you have this individual who is more than a little disturbed and, socially awkward, who now has this worm in his brain, basically, telling him to, kill people and eat them so it can feed off of them. And so, yeah. In the meantime, Jake, Jake Corey, the police officer, he's able to, find out some more information about about the weird death of the insane motorist Eddie, because the town coroner has not only his body in the morgue, but also the body of Ron, the guy who was eating his own wife, and Jake had to kill in self-defense. So the coroner, has these two guys in the morgue, and he's showing them some weird stuff that he found. And basically, on both bodies, there were basically parts of their flesh wherein, there was like this visible series of bulges, like something that had burrowed its way through their bodies. And he was showing them, he was showing Jake where basically, something was able to, slip its way, into their bodies, where it made its way, up their spinal columns and, into their brains, but it was doing so by getting in between their skeletal structure and their skin. And so, considering that, both individuals, were acting irrationally and were homicidal, just almost certainly homicidal, what with Eddie, trying to, run Celia down, with no logical explanation, and and Ron trying to eat his wife after having killed her with no logical explanation, plus the fact that there's an exit wound on both bodies around their abdomen area, or their abdominal area, that Jake didn't notice before, because the spots weren't visible at the time. The coroner's basically telling Jake that he also found some like residue, like some weird residue that, I mean, it seems organic in nature, but it wasn't a part of the human body. And so he's theorizing that some kind of parasite had gotten inside of first Eddie and then Ron at some point, and had basically driven them mad, to a point where they became cannibalistic and homicidal. And so with that in mind, Jake is trying to figure out, okay, how did this happen, where did this start? And so naturally he's going to have to go back to where he first encountered this, the Oakwood Inn, and sure enough, he does find something freaky down there. And in the meantime, Roland has this new friend in his brain telling him what to do, and basically racks up a body count, and works up an appetite for both himself and this thing in his head now. So yeah, so that's the synopsis. That's the basic gist of Flesh. I'm not going to tell you all how it all goes down at the end, because it's pretty wild. But yeah, I actually liked this one. I think that, as I mentioned earlier, this is definitely up there in terms of Richard Laymon's best. And so one of the things I like about this one is that, I mean, while the violence for sure is brutal and gruesome, and definitely disturbing, for Richard Laymon, in some ways, it's kind of subdued. I mean, okay, let's put it this way. If you're not a horror fan and you're reading, then this is your first time reading Richard Laymon, it's not subdued. But from the perspective of someone who's read some of his other work and then is reading this, yeah, it's not as intense as some of his other stuff. But at the same time, I mean, when you have descriptions of Roland basically, shattering, someone's skull and eating their brains, I mean, yeah, that's pretty gruesome and pretty disturbing. But compared to, say, some of the other stuff that comes up in some of Richard Laymon's other work, It's not quite as bad. But on the other hand, though, one of the things I also liked about it was that, you know, as gruesome as the stuff is, I think one of the reasons why it comes across as so subdued is that um, it's not wall to wall carnage. It's like there are moments of carnage. It's like there's like a build up. I mean, there's that flashbang starts at the beginning where Eddie tries to run Celia down for no discernible reason other than, hey, this looks like fun. And of course then when we find out that he had this parasite in him. I mean, things might make a little more sense. That I mean, he was doing it of his own free will, but at the same time, he probably wouldn't have done it, without this thing in his head. So, um, but from but after that moment, when the other moments of violence happen, it's like there's a build up to them that's gradual. And the moments themselves are sudden, but there's like a sense of suspense. And so even though things are flowing at a fast pace, you know, there are um, there is an element of suspense that is very palpable, especially like the scene where, or the part where Roland's in the Oakwood Inn, and he's got all this stuff going on in his head. I mean, this is before the creature gets inside of him, but I mean, we get an inside look into his thought processes, and he has like this existential breakdown, because Dana called him out on his bullshit. He's got that going on, and then he's in this hotel, or this this inn where someone was recently murdered rather brutally, and then he's got Dana's conversation with him about ghosts rattling around in his head, and the lights are off, and here he is handcuffed. So you see this guy becoming more and more freaked out. And this is terrifying enough, because I mean, Richard Laymon does a good job of, I mean, even though this character is unlikable, I mean, he's so far written as someone who is human, and the sense of fear that he's feeling is very relatable, even if he himself is not as a character. But the feeling of fear that he's experiencing is relatable. But so when this creature gets inside of him, that's when things go up to 11. Okay, so it's like there's a build up, and then payoff. And so, and it was a similar thing with when Jake finds Ron chowing down on his wife, on his wife Peggy, and because before that, when Peggy's begging Ron not to go into the basement, and he does anyway, and there's that brief moment where she can't see or hear him. I mean, it's like we're seeing it all from her perspective, and she can't even see what happens to him. All she can hear is him shouting out suddenly, like freaked out. And so it's like Richard Laymon does a good job of putting you into the mind of the characters that are going through some horrific situations, and showing us things through their eyes. And I also liked the main characters. I mean, okay, so I'm not going to say I quote unquote liked Roland, but I thought that Roland was actually in some ways a compelling antagonist, or a villain, protagonist, I guess you could say, because he is one of the main characters, but not a good guy. But I think it was mainly because Richard Laymon went out of his way to humanize him, in the sense that he's having like this mental breakdown when Dana called him out on his behavior, because it felt like something very relatable in that regard. And so we can buy him as a real person, even if we don't like him as a person, but we can buy him as a real person. And so when this thing gets inside of him, that's when he goes from, okay, you know, someone who's, a little unhinged, but somewhat relatable in a sense of wanting to fit in some way, um, and just having this internal breakdown, and then suddenly going from that to, oh, I've got this thing in my head that makes me feel so good, and all I gotta do is, kill people and, feed and eat them so my friend can eat them, and it's very, alarming, that, transition, because it's like the feeling of bliss, the way it's described, it's very brief, right? But the impact that it has on its victims, it basically gets them addicted to it. And basically the creature, it basically has it to where, you know, they're hooked on this feeling of bliss. And if they want more of it, they've, got to take ill they if they want him if they want it to take care of them, then they have to take care of it by, killing and eating people. Um, and so one of the interesting things about this creature is that even though we don't get a whole lot of, insight as to, exactly what it is or where it came from, like, we don't know if it came from another planet or if it was, a part of, if it was a creature, from Earth that maybe had only uh, been rediscovered, not recently or something like that. We don't know a whole lot about it, if anything, other than that, it likes human flesh, or it basically feeds vicariously through others. Like it doesn't eat the flesh itself, but once it's inside, a host's body, when the host is eating the flesh, it's able to benefit from that. But we don't know where it came from. We don't know, what its exact thought processes are. It's like any sort of insight we get into a creature, we're seeing from the perspective of Roland, because it's almost like, excuse me, like it'll be able to, like he is able to have memories that the creature has had, from other experiences, through other hosts. And there's a moment where Roland is given a sort of glimpse into this creature's past, and it's one of the few instances where we're given some insight into this creature, as far as, like, if maybe not where it came from, then at least how old it is. Where he has this, flashback from, there's this Native American tribe, and I think it may have been the Mayans, the ones that were, whichever one it was that practiced human sacrifice, that wherein someone was selected to be a sacrificial victim and have their hearts cut out for the gods. Well, in this memory that Roland's experiencing from this creature had a Mayan, had a ruler of the tribe, right, as a host. And while the tribe was already practicing human sacrifice, this creature, basically, compelled its host to, go beyond, hearts, and basically engage in cannibalism. And so it turns out that, this whole time, society and, historians, they had thought that, this tribe of Native Americans, were basically, fixated on, cannibalism, because of, some sort of religious belief. But this whole time, it was because this creature had gotten inside, one of these, rulers' heads, and, basically, because this guy was in a position of power, was able to, command his, tribe to, feed him the sacrificial victim's brains. And so, yeah, you get, a little lovely insight like that. So that's probably like the closest, moment we get where we find out something about the creature and about its past. And so even though we don't know where it came from, we at least have an idea of how old it is. So yeah, I liked how there wasn't a ton of stuff revealed about the creature, which in some ways made it scarier. But what little insight we did get was interesting, and disturbing, of course. But I liked the character of Jake Corey, the police officer, and I also liked the character of Allison, the college student, because I mean, in both instances, I think Richard Laymon did a good job of giving some depth and substance to both characters. Because while the book still has that sort of signature pulp feel, like the characters themselves, namely Jake and Allison, they themselves don't feel like pulp characters. Like they feel like fleshed out, three-dimensional characters, and who happen to be in a sort of pulp setting. I mean, you have this, possibly, alien creature, going around, controlling people, or at the very least compelling people to give into their dark sides. I mean, some otherworldly element, which definitely feels like something from a pulp story. But then on the other hand, you have these very human characters. I mean, you got Jake, who, I mean, yeah, he's very good at his job as a police officer, and he cares about, the people in his jurisdiction and everything. He cares about, doing a good job. But he also, has a difficult family situation. I mean, he's got his daughter that he's, having to, keep an eye on, and someone that he's wanting to try and protect her from the dangers of the world, as well as from the negligence of her mother, and so some of the stuff about like about him and his wife being divorced and everything, some of that stuff hit home, because if you know someone who's been divorced, then sometimes it's like, yeah, maybe they get along with each other for the sake of their kid, and then other times it's like, yeah, one of them will say they care about the kid, but then they're just using the kid for attention or something like that, whereas the other parent actually does care about the kid, stuff like that. So yeah, some of that stuff actually felt very real, and the stress and the frustration that Jake felt about the situation, and having to walk a line between on one hand being a good father for Kimmy, while at the same time not being disrespectful to her mother, even though she's not being a good mother. Like some of that stuff felt very real to me. And of course, the interactions between Jake and his daughter Kimmy were very endearing. And so you're basically, given like not only an oasis for Jake, but you're giving him, but you see him being given further incentive to try and figure out what's going on, in terms of, say, this gruesome murder and what have you. And so, I mean, I like it when a writer is able to give incentive to a character in that way, like wherein they're in a situation that is nightmarish, but there's like that one person there that is sort of like a beacon of hope, or a sort of a piece of stability for them, and so I liked seeing that. And also, Jake, the way he's written, I mean, he just really comes across as a good guy, who's, trying to do his job and everything. But here he is in something, from straight out of a nightmare. And yeah, so, yeah, this was definitely an instance, I think, where Richard Laymon, went out of his way to flesh the characters out, so to speak. And as far as Allison goes, uh, some people might think that she's written as like a caricature or something, in a sense of there, like, it does feel like a soap opera at times with her character and her F buddy Evan. Uh, but at the same time, when you're reading from her perspective about things, like, you know there there are very real situations in the world where people get into relationships with one another, wherein it's like it's mainly based on sex or something like that, or just physical intimacy. And somewhere along the way, one of them, is going to be like, well, hey, I mean, yeah, this is fun, but does this person actually like me? Do they actually care about me? Or are they just with me to hit it? That kind of thing. And so stuff like that, I mean, that's very real too. And so when she comes to that, point where she decides to, you know, bring the possibility up to Evan about, hey, why don't we just see if we can have a relationship that doesn't revolve around that, and because, I mean, she makes it clear she does enjoy it, but the fact that she's noticing that, I mean, it's almost nothing but that, and he doesn't want to do anything with her beyond that. I mean, it really felt like someone coming to a realization and having a light bulb moment that they need to they need to see if this person is actually worthwhile, like worth being with, or if this person's going to be a good person to be with beyond that. And so when she brings it up to Evan, and Evan reacts the way he does, I mean, that was believable too, because some people, they're going to be like, okay, I mean, you don't want to do it anymore, all right, adios. And it's like, you look in real life and all that, there are people who, I mean, yeah, they're shallow like that, but I mean, sometimes they're like, okay, I mean, yes, they were in it for the physical stuff, but when the other person makes it clear that hey, they're wanting some more, they can be like, okay, it was fun, but it's time to go. I mean, they can be nice about it, but other times, like Evan, they can be a jerk about it too, or they can be real mean about it. And so when that happened, I really did feel for Allison, and the emotional pain that she was going through, as well as the conflicted desires that she had, because I mean, she was enjoying being with him physically, but she wanted someone to actually respect her and care about her as a person. So um so yeah, like that little moment where she's at the Galleria, and she's sort of fighting inside, to try and you know, stay away from Evan, but at the same time buying that piece of negligee, on the off chance things go up again. But she's still like she's conflicted about it. Like, that felt very real. And so yeah, I mean, Allison was actually a good character too. And I did like her friends, Celia and Helen. I mean, they really came across as, some people that, really had Allison's back and cared about her and everything. And I did kind of like the little twist of, because we're thinking that Celia is going to be one of the main characters. I mean, she's definitely one of the important characters for sure, but because she's first introduced in the book before Allison, I was thinking that she was going to be one of the main characters, like she was going to be the main character like Allison was, but then Laymon throws in a twist, and Celia basically serves to be one of the people to introduce us as readers to Allison. So and granted, we first meet Allison when she's hooking up with Evan, but it's shortly after that when she meets up with one of her friends, and that friend turns out to be Celia, and she's like, well, what happened to you, because she's all banged up and everything. So yeah, I like that little unexpected twist of the person who seems to be like they're going to be the main character turning out to be a supporting character and vice versa. So that was actually pretty cool too. So yeah, this was definitely an instance where, Richard Laymon did a good job of, on one hand, definitely, spooking us and disturbing us as readers when it came to, say, building a sense of suspense and having a gruesome payoff, but also going out of his way to, give us some fleshed out characters, as it were. See what I did there? So yeah, I mean, definitely, this was definitely one of his best works, I think. I will say though that I think there were some moments where maybe there were missed opportunities for horror, or there were some moments where I felt like the way things were handled were a bit unbelievable. Like, one of the bits I felt like was a little unbelievable was Dana basically stripping completely naked, um, and to make herself look like a ghost to scare Roland. I mean, okay, her wanting to scare Roland makes sense, but literally getting getting naked to where he'll be able to see everything. I mean, and knowing that Roland is as wacko as he is, and this is before he has a creature in him. I mean, I was like, scaring. I understand you wanted to scare him, but why the hell are you showing everything to this guy who's clearly a mentally unhealthy individual? Um, so when she ends up buying the farm like she does, I mean, I figured something was going to happen to her, but I'm kind of like, yeah, you kind of brought it on yourself. So you have moments like that where certain characters, make poor decisions or illogical decisions. And of course, I mean, there's another point where, Roland is luring another character to the Oakwood Inn under false pretenses, basically saying that, I mean, he gives this one character like this completely bonkers um, situation. He says that that something completely bonkers has happened, and that he's going to need this person's help to help this other person, but it's actually a ploy to kill him and someone else, so that way he can feed on their bodies while the creature can have more food and give Roland a bigger boost of ecstasy. But the thing is, it's like, he's given this one character this, cockamamie story, and it's like, as a reader, you're kind of like, there's no way this character is going to believe this. But then this character believes it and goes along with this crazy idea and follows Roland's instructions completely. And even though they make no sense whatsoever, and you're like, dude, you've got to know that you're being set up somehow, but the character doesn't. And so you do have some moments where, I mean, you do get the gruesome payoff and everything, but at the same time, you're kind of like, slap in your head like that, at least mentally. Like, no one could be that stupid, right? But then someone's that stupid. But, and I guess the one other thing I could think of was, while I did like the character of the coroner, I mean, the way he was written, like, he was like one of those old timers that's kind of seen it all, done it all, and he's seen some crazy stuff in his profession. But, and I liked, the scene where he and Jake are in the morgue, and the coroner, he's showing Jake, the two bodies, and showing him the weird shit that's going on with them, or that has gone on with them. So I like the coroner's, morbid sense of humor, because apparently that's what coroners are like, in a lot of instances. They have to have a morbid sense of humor to, be able to stay sane, right? Or at the very least, to stay, somewhat happy in a, morbid profession. But when he and Jake are talking about, okay, what do we need to do, or what do we do from here? If there's this parasite going around, turning people into, you know, cannibalistic, maniacs. I mean, what do we do? And it kind of made me think of the plot element in Halloween, the original Halloween, where Sheriff Brackett is telling Dr. Loomis that, hey, we need to, bring in the whole police force to hunt Michael Myers down. If this guy's, if your patient's escaped from the mental institution and is, wandering around my neighborhood, we need to, track him down before he kills more people. And Dr. Loomis is saying, no, you do that. If you tell everyone in the neighborhood about him, everyone's going to see Michael Myers everywhere you go. No, we need to keep this quiet and just keep this between us, and we'll be the ones to, sort of go throughout the neighborhood, just checking things out, right? And of course, when with that, you have certain people in that movie getting killed who didn't need to get killed. Um, it's like, if you're looking at it from a real life perspective, you're like, okay, that was just a stupid decision, right? Like, because they only kept it to themselves, people died that didn't need to die, right? Well, it's a similar situation in Flesh, where the coroner and Jake, after talking about the situation, they decide that the best way to go about things is to keep it to themselves, and try and track the creature down themselves. And so basically Jake, he believes in the idea that there's this parasite that's going around turning people crazy, right? But in his mind, he's thinking that if he tells say like the National Guard about it, or if he tells the military about it, then they're going to think he's crazy. Or if he tells other police officers about it, they're going to think he's crazy, right? But it's one of those instances where you're like, okay, if you and the coroner, like the coroner who's a medical professional and was able to verify that, yes, some sort of parasitic organism had gotten inside these people and turned them insane and cannibalistic. I mean, you go to the authorities or higher authorities with medical verification from a medical professional. I mean, I'd like to think that, those higher authorities would be like, okay, we need to send in, a whole bunch of people to track this thing down. I mean, I think that had that been the case, there would have been a lot more eyes on the situation, and, certain characters who ended up getting killed in the book that didn't need to get killed wouldn't have gotten killed. But I guess the argument could be made if, Jake and the coroner had been, logical about the situation like that, then the novel would have been a little shorter. So there you go. I mean, that is one of the downsides to horror. Characters do logical things, and, well, you wouldn't have much of a movie or story. So, I mean, I guess that kind of comes with the territory. And one other thing, I mean, I'm not going to say it's a problem necessarily, but I do think that there were some missed opportunities in the sense of the creature, because, I mean, minor spoiler, the threat comes from one creature, okay? And I mean, yes, we do, get moments in the book where it's made clear that there are others out there, right? But as far as the main horror of the book, it's just one creature, okay, that's going around turning people into parasites, or I'm sorry, that going or turning people into maniacs, homicidal maniacs. But I think that there would have been a greater source of horror if, say, there had been more creatures, that were full grown and that were going around getting inside people, because then you'd have a situation wherein, much like in Richard Laymon's, novel Resurrection Dreams, you have, multiple sex crazed zombies, running around that look just like ordinary people, but they're undead, right? That was actually a pretty that resulted in some genuinely scary moments in that book. Even though the book itself wasn't that good, those resulted in some scary moments, you know. Um, or though, I mean, that the nature of those, of the fact that there were multiple sex crazed zombies in that book made for some scary moments, okay, because they looked like everyone else. So there could have been a similar approach in Flesh if there had been multiple, full grown parasites getting inside people. I mean, I'm not saying like there needed to be like 100 of them or anything like that, because then it would be like, okay, you'd have a very short book. Everyone would die, right? But if there'd been more than one creature, then I think the suspense would have been enhanced, because then it's like, okay, whereas it's bad enough in this book, there's just one of them, and trying to find out, okay, who's the host of this thing? Like, we as readers know who the host is. I mean, for them, at least when this stuff's focusing on Roland. But in terms of, say, like the other characters' perspectives, like the ones who know about what's going on, they're like, okay, who's the host? So imagine that, but amplified if there had been more than one of these worm things, right? But on the other hand, I feel like, while the horror would have been enhanced in some ways if that had been the case, I do feel like in this instance, with there being only one worm creature in this book, doing all like causing all the chaos, I think that made the horror more immediate. When you combine that with, this is a small rural town, I mean, horror in the country is something that tends to be more immediate than, say, urban horror in some cases, because with urban horror, you've got a whole bunch of people, and you got, okay, if there's some maniac running around with a knife trying to kill you, you could be like, hey, there's some maniac with a knife trying to kill me, and then a whole bunch of people converge on the guy and beat the crap out of him, right? Whereas in the more rural setting, there's more of a sense of isolation, and it's a bit harder to get a bunch of people to converge on the threat. Plus the fact that this was written in the 80s, so payphones were still a thing, but cell phones were not. Yeah, that definitely made it to where communication was kind of obstructed, which definitely made things more suspenseful at times. So yeah, this is definitely one of those books that I think could only work in the 80s or 90s, because there's no cell phones. So yeah, like there being the fact that there's no cell phones, plus the fact that there's only one creature and it's in a rural setting, it does make the horror feel more immediate and more intimate, so to speak. And it's kind of like, I guess another way you could look at it is, I mean, it's a similar comparison of, say, you got Alien, you got the movie Alien, and then you have Aliens. In Ridley Scott's Alien, there's just one monster, but it's nonetheless, it's a very terrifying monster, right? And you have a crew of people that are woefully unprepared for it. And so then in Aliens, I mean, you have a group of people that have more preparation and weapons and everything, but there's like hundreds of these things now. So I mean, so it's like both great movies, right? But I think that the horror was a lot more immediate with Alien, because there's only one of these things, and there's a small group of characters that are out of their depth, and so I think that would be a similar approach, that's a good comparison. Like, if there had been multiple worm creatures, we would have probably had more along the lines of Aliens. But in this case, we have something like Alien. If the alien in Alien was a creature that basically made you want to kill and eat people. So. But yeah, I mean, all in all, Flesh was a good book. And also, I liked that, much like the other novels I've read by Richard Laymon, it flows at a really good pace. I mean, I literally read this in one sittings, and it's 355 pages. And so, the fact that I was able to do that in one night, I mean, I was like, that doesn't happen very often. So, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and give Flesh 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good book. And, unlike Resurrection Dreams, I mean, this had a good premise and it delivered on it. And not just in moments, like throughout the whole book, it delivered on it. Like the problems I mentioned, I think they keep the book from being great, but they do not keep the book from being good. So if you've never read anything by Richard Laymon before, and if you want to read one of the certifiably good ones, Flesh is a good place to start, because you get that, you still get that, visceral, style of blood and gore, but there's a genuine sense of suspense, and there's some genuinely good character development as well. So you actually care about what happens to certain people in this book, and when certain people are the main characters, yeah, you're invested. And so, and yeah, the worm, the creature, granted, a lot more of the horror is conveyed through the human hosts that it has, but at the same time, when we do come face to face with this creature, it's pretty scary. So, but yeah, that was Flesh, Richard Laymon's Flesh, 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good book. So, if you made it this far, thank you very much for taking the time to, check out my review. You got any questions, comments, please drop a line, let me know. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. So, y'all take care, have a good night, bye.